Hello, my name is Donna Malley and I'm an occupational therapy clinical specialist, and I'm here today to talk to you about understanding and managing fatigue following a sudden cardiac arrest. So why are we discussing this topic? It's actually one of the most common and distressing of symptoms reported following an acquired brain injury, and that includes traumatic brain injury and stroke, as well as a range of other neurological conditions. Paul Swindle of the SCA UK Society conducted a survey and received 230 respondents of people who had experienced a sudden cardiac arrest. Of those, 93% reported experiencing fatigue at some point in their journey since their cardiac arrest. And only 7% recalled actually being informed that fatigue was a symptom that they might experience. Fatigue negatively impacts upon rehabilitation outcomes and quality of life for individuals, but it has a ripple effect because it also can contribute to strain and reduced quality of life in relatives and carers, and it's associated with lower rates of return to work. So fatigue has an impact at both a personal level as well as a wider impact upon the economy. So why does fatigue actually occur? Well, multiple factors contribute to make somebody more vulnerable to fatigue after a cardiac arrest. And these can include changes within the brain, within the networks and the cells within brain in specific areas due to a disruption in the oxygen supply that occurred at the time of the cardiac arrest. This makes it harder for the brain to kind of think and communicate with different areas efficiently. So it feels much more effortful to use our thinking skills such as concentration and remembering and decision making and planning. It can be a consequence of changes to our mood and emotions and our ability to adjust to this new change in circumstances. It can be a result of physical factors such as pain or changes to our sleep patterns, or even changes as a result of medication side effects or other medical conditions an individual might have. So it's complicated and we need to try to tease apart what factors are relevant for that particular individual. Everyone who I've spoken to in relation to fatigue describes three different types. One type is a physical fatigue, which probably many of us are familiar with after we've done some physical exercise. But mental and emotional fatigue are much harder to make sense of and understand and tolerate where they're coming from. So there are lots of different activities or situations that can act as what we might call triggers for experiencing a real drawdown on our available mental and physical resources. And some of the typical ones that I hear are things such as concentrating, such as when people are trying to read a book or watch a film or complete some forms. Worrying is an enormous drainer, anxiety and worry, and sometimes that can be in anticipation of an event, not actually within the event itself. Travelling is often described as particularly fatiguing, as well as socialising and shopping, including supermarket shops, and that's, we think, because of the very stimulating environment in which those activities take place. Unusually, some people might say, what's holidays doing on there as a potential trigger for fatigue? But actually, this was a real lesson for me when I understood and spoke to people who described that they actually sometimes dreaded holidays and weekends where there was no structure to the day, no plan. And so it made it really hard for them to make decisions in the moment and pace themselves effectively at those times. So busy, noisy places where there's lots of information to process, sights, sounds, smells, movement, are all likely to be contributors and triggers for fatigue. Sometimes we can identify these triggers by activity monitoring and rating fatigue at intervals during the day or before and after particular activities that we think might be suspects. But many people struggle to identify triggers. And as a result of that, can perceive a lack of control over their fatigue and sense that it kind of comes out of nowhere until they just can't think anymore. And it makes it very difficult then for them to plan ahead and think about, well, am I going to have enough energy to do this thing that I want to put in my diary later today or later this week? And the disruption that then contributes to in terms of planning and organising and living their lives with others. For many people, it's difficult to notice the early warning signs until they become particularly intense because all of their cognitive efforts are going on to the thing that they're trying to do rather than how it's making them feel. And as a consequence, many people describe a sense of sensory overload. And changes to their mood and behaviour, changes to physically how they feel. Their limbs might feel heavier, or people describe headaches. All cognitive symptoms such as finding it harder to find the word you want to say, or harder to think or make decisions, that kind of thing. So fatigue can actually exacerbate other symptoms associated with the cardiac arrest. So what can we do? Well, I think over the years I've learned that there are 5 key principles to help us to make the best use of our available resources, because all of us will have different amounts of energy at different times in the day. So it's about being able to maximize how many resources we have by living a healthy lifestyle. So that's getting a good diet and a varied diet, good quality and sufficient sleep, and participating in regular exercise. And obviously after a cardiac arrest, probably getting advice from a doctor or a physiotherapist to make sure that there are no other constraints that we might need to take into account before we undertake such exercise. And also whether there are any other medical factors that might be contributing to fatigue. So, for example, changes to hormone levels. Pacing is something I hear a lot of people being advised to do, but it's actually really tricky to work out for individuals. So you're not alone if you find you're struggling to pace yourself. And it's about prioritising activities and planning ahead, but as we described, that's easier said than done. And it's not even as simple as being able to take frequent breaks to recharge our battery, because the kind of breaks we need will depend on the resources we've depleted. So whereas sitting down and physically resting might be helpful after becoming physically fatigued, it's not something that usually is helpful after doing some mental or emotionally activated activity, because you can't switch your head off so easily. So one of the things we do in order to help people to pace is to help them to work out what helps them to properly switch off. Energy conservation is about modifying the environment and organising tools and materials in our working area to reduce the physical and mental effort involved in a task. And sometimes that might involve using tools and strategies, some of which are very familiar to all of us, to reduce the cognitive load and increase the likelihood of success. And I can't emphasise enough how important it is to talk to others, to help them to understand how you're feeling and share experiences. So when we're thinking about modifying the environment, it's not just the physical environment that we need to consider. It's things like the noise levels, the lighting, the temperature. It often helps if we reduce the amount of visual things to look at in a room. So tidying away clutter behind closed doors is a really good idea. Sometimes, therefore, putting labels to remember where we've put something, and even where we sit in a room to avoid distractions and help us to concentrate. So it might be about managing interruptions and breaking tasks down into bite-sized chunks. Cognitive strategies are ways to help support us to think less effortfully and to not make attention slips or memory slips quite as frequently as we do, because it is human to make the odd cognitive slip. So strategies can include all sorts of things, such as setting an alarm to wake us up or to remind us that we have to go to an appointment in an hour's time, reminders, post-it notes, calendars, checklists. There are many different things that we can use to support our cognitive functioning. Switching off the brain can be really tricky for some people, and sometimes it might be worth making a referral to a clinical psychologist to address symptoms when they're reaching particular levels of anxiety or depression. It's understandable that people are going to have a level of worry, and some people might struggle to adjust to the changes and the consequences of living following a sudden cardiac arrest. And there are a range of different psychological techniques that can be useful in those situations. We also need to remember that sometimes worries can be associated with very real practical concerns, such as financial concerns, and support people to access support to alleviate some of those practical concerns. And what we need to do is draw this together to create a personalised fatigue action plan so that we can spot our early warning signs that our energy is starting to dip, and take action then before we actually reach rock bottom. There is a growing body of evidence for some very specific interventions. A team approach, given the multifactorial nature of fatigue, is something which is well understood now. But there is some growing evidence base around certain types of medication that can be helpful for people. There's something called blue light therapy, which is a particular wavelength of light that people can use that might enable them to have more energy during the day. Mindfulness-based stress reduction groups, as well as educational and support groups. And it's probably likely that there's not a one-size-fits-all. A combination of different types of these interventions is needed for different individuals. So this complicated diagram just reminds me as a clinician of the range of things we need to do in order to investigate what personal factors are affecting that particular person and their experience of fatigue and how they manage it. It's a bit like a detective process, I think. And it's about sort of personalising strategies and working with the individual, using a collaborative approach to try to create a shared understanding, learn personal triggers and indicators of fatigue for that particular individual, and enable them to maximise their available resources in the best way. So it's common, it's complicated, but there are things that we can do, and there are clinicians out there that can be helpful. So please do seek advice and support and referral onwards if you are struggling to manage your fatigue, so that we can try to support you to manage this very common symptom after cardiac arrest. Thank you.